I'm Margaret, I'm 70 years old, and surgery can wait, right? Is exactly what my son said before choosing his wife's birthday party over my emergency operation. And that night, I quietly called the real estate agent I had ignored for years, signed the pre-sale paperwork, and scheduled the house inspection for first thing in the morning without telling a soul. Before I continue my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories about standing up to family betrayal and reclaiming your power after decades of silence, because what happened next will show you exactly how quietly a mother can disappear when she's had enough. I've been retired for 5 years after managing records for Company A for over 3 decades. And while the job didn't make me rich, I kept every receipt, every deed, every account password and insurance policy organized in a fireproof box my son never cared to ask about. Yesterday afternoon, the doctor at Clinic B told me that the growing mass pressing against my stomach wall was aggressive and needed to be removed the next morning. And even though my hands were shaking and my throat was dry, I called my son first, because he was the only family I had left and I needed someone to be there in case something went wrong. I spent 38 years raising him alone after my husband died in a train accident, working weekends and holidays, saying no to vacations and dinners out, just so he could finish high school, go to college, and never once feel the absence of a father when it came to tuition or meals. He answered on the 3rd ring, and when I told him about the tumor and the surgery and the fear that I couldn't name out loud, he paused just long enough to check the calendar and told me he couldn't come because it was his wife's birthday, and they had reservations at a restaurant he'd never taken me to. He didn't ask if I needed anything, he didn't offer to reschedule the celebration, and he didn't seem to remember that I was the one who gave him and his wife the down payment for that home they post online like they earned it alone. And when I hung up, I sat still long enough to feel the full weight of what I already knew. My son had made it clear. His wife's dinner meant more than my life. 38 years of sacrifice were erased by one sentence. I didn't argue, I didn't cry, and I didn't try to convince him, because when a mother has to explain why her life matters, it's already too late. I took out my planner, turned to the financial notes in the back, and called the lawyer I hadn't spoken to in 7 years. Then I opened the drawer where I kept the property documents and bank books my son had never seen and stacked them in a travel folder next to the copy of my living will. That night, while other families celebrated and posed for pictures, I packed my hospital bag alone, reviewed the instructions from the surgeon, and wrote down the emergency contact as none, because the only person I could count on had chosen seafood and champagne over showing up. No one should have to go into surgery alone at 70 years old. But I did. When the neighbor across the hall came by to check in after seeing the hospital envelope on my table, I smiled and lied and said my son was busy with work and would come later, because I didn't want to explain that the only person I ever loved had already decided I was disposable. I sent one final message to my son before bed, telling him the procedure would begin at 9, and if he happened to have time afterward, he could call, and he replied with a thumbs-up emoji and a message saying, "Good luck, we're doing brunch tomorrow too." He didn't even ask the name of the hospital. I didn't sleep that night. At 6 a.m., I called a taxi, paid in cash, walked into the hospital alone, and handed over my paperwork to a nurse who asked me twice if I was really unaccompanied, and I nodded because nothing had changed. Other patients had family holding their bags, husbands adjusting pillows, daughters giving last-minute encouragements. My son didn't even check the time. Before they wheeled me into the operating room, the nurse asked again if I wanted someone called, and I told her no, because I had already buried every last hope the night before. I counted backwards under the anesthesia with a knot in my chest, not from the surgery but from the silence I knew I'd wake up to. The moment I opened my eyes in recovery, I turned my head and looked toward the door, hoping for something that didn't come. He never showed up. He didn't call. He didn't even pretend to care. My son abandoned me for a dinner reservation, and I still paid his mortgage. That morning, I knew something for certain. A birthday cake meant more than my body on a table. The morning after surgery, I signed the discharge documents myself, arranged another taxi, and left the hospital without hearing a single word from my son, who still hadn't messaged or called, not even to ask if I survived the procedure he said was no big deal. I stopped by the pharmacy alone, paid out of pocket for the prescribed medication, and kept my head down as I passed couples and families escorting their loved ones home, knowing that I was the only one leaving a hospital in silence after surgery that was considered urgent by every medical staff member except my own child. When I got home, I didn't take off my shoes or sit down. Instead, I walked directly to the cabinet where I stored every document related to my financial history and pulled out the folders labeled property, savings, insurance, and emergency contingency, because I had finally accepted that I could not rely on someone who only remembered I existed when he needed something. 5 years earlier, when my son and his wife got married, I handed over 6 million yen to help with their down payment and furniture, believing that helping them build a stable home was the final gift a mother could give, and I never once reminded them of the amount because I didn't think kindness needed to be repaid. That decision now felt like a cruel joke. He told me to go to surgery alone and still expected financial support without shame. I remembered his graduation day, when he cried and told me he wouldn't have made it without me, and how I believed him enough to give him more, because I thought tears meant gratitude. He knew exactly what kind of mother I was, reliable, silent, and always available, and that's why he didn't even hesitate before choosing a birthday party over a hospital room. While I prepared for a second follow-up appointment, my phone finally vibrated with a message from him that said he hoped the surgery went okay and that they'd come by the next evening if they finished their errands early, and that sentence told me everything I needed to know about my place in his life. I didn't respond. They arrived 26 hours after my discharge, empty-handed and smiling like they were dropping by for tea, not visiting a woman who had just had a tumor removed without anyone by her side. And the first thing they said wasn't, "How are you?" or "I'm sorry," but a joke about how dramatic I was being. They told me I made too big a deal out of something simple, that hospitals do these procedures every day, that the doctors probably didn't even consider it life-threatening, and that it wasn't worth making such a fuss over. I sat through their visit like I was attending someone else's trial. They dismissed my fear, ignored my pain, and then, without hesitation, transitioned the conversation into what they really came for, money. They wanted 3 million yen for a new car because theirs felt outdated, and they said it so casually I wondered if they even remembered that I was still recovering from anesthesia. They added that everyone in their social circle had luxury vehicles, that they were the only ones driving something that embarrassed them, and that it would really help their image if they could upgrade this month before the trip they were planning abroad. I didn't answer immediately, and that was enough to trigger my son's frustration, as if hesitating to hand over millions right after surgery made me ungrateful. He reminded me that I had always supported him, that this was no different, and that if I cared about his well-being, I wouldn't think twice. His wife chimed in to say that I lived alone, had no debt, and barely spent anything, so it didn't make sense to hold on to money I clearly didn't need, and they both looked at me like I was selfish for keeping what I earned. They made it sound like I owed them my entire savings just because they were younger. They said I should be happy they still came to visit me after everything, as if abandoning me at a hospital was a minor offense I should have already forgiven. They told me I should be proud of how independent they'd become, all while begging for money to fund their lifestyle. In that moment, I stopped seeing them as family. I became a bank account with a heartbeat. Every word they said made it clearer that they didn't visit out of concern, they visited to collect. I told them I would think about it, but I already knew the answer, and I already knew what came next. I waited until they left, then pulled out the folder labeled Assets, and began a new page titled Exit Plan. I called the lawyer again and scheduled an appointment for the end of the week, and while I waited, I reviewed every investment, every account, and every property appraisal I had kept updated over the years. What they didn't know was that the house I lived in had tripled in value thanks to the recent rezoning near District C, and the land alone could sell for nearly 30 million yen. I calculated the numbers carefully. Property equity, liquid savings, and my pension payouts combined placed me far above what they had always assumed I had. They believed I was a modest retiree barely getting by. They had no idea I had the power to walk away without telling them a single word. They used my silence as an excuse to take, and now they would learn that silence doesn't mean permission. They told me their happiness depended on me. They were wrong. 3 days later, I arrived at the attorney's office carrying every relevant document they would need to begin the legal process of selling the property, transferring accounts, and rewriting the emergency contact protocols. Because I had decided that if my own son could abandon me in a hospital, then I no longer owed him access to anything I built. The attorney reviewed the deed, the latest appraisal data, and the inheritance paperwork I had never updated since my husband passed away 35 years ago, and he confirmed that the sale could move forward immediately without my son's knowledge or consent because I was the sole owner of the property and all associated assets. I authorized the listing process on the spot and signed the brokerage agreement with real estate agent A, who explained that the recent development of Zone B made my house one of the most desirable listings in the area and that I could expect multiple offers within a week if I agreed to a quick walkthrough and photo package. I approved the listing preparation, handed over the keys for internal access, and requested that all communication be made through email so there would be a paper trail, because I already knew that when my son found out, he would accuse me of irrational behavior or mental instability just to try and reverse my decision. I then visited the bank and transferred a portion of my liquid funds into a new account under a separate branch to ensure that even if someone accessed my main balance, they would not be able to interfere with my relocation funds. And while I was there, I asked to review all automatic payments and froze the recurring transfers I had set up to cover their utilities. They never noticed those monthly payments came from me, not from any agreement, not from obligation, but from a mother's quiet instinct to help, an instinct they took advantage of until it no longer served them. I contacted the administrator of Retirement Facility A and scheduled a private tour of their highest-tier living arrangement, which included full nursing access, meal planning, and a resident wellness program, and I scheduled the viewing under my maiden name so my son wouldn't hear about it through any clerical error or neighborhood gossip. I paid the application fee in cash and requested the soonest available move-in date, which the administrator confirmed would be within 30 days as long as my documents cleared and the deposit was processed before the end of the week. They gave me a folder with all the required paperwork, and I spent the evening completing the medical assessment, care preference checklist, and inheritance opt-out declaration, which ensured that once I moved in, my next of kin would not be allowed access to any of my affairs unless I signed an exception form, which I had no intention of doing. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not friends, not neighbors, not the family members who sent obligatory cards twice a year but never called, because I had already learned that sympathy was temporary, but silence was permanent, and I preferred not to be interrupted while I dismantled the version of motherhood they had built around me. They thought I would always be there. They thought I would always say yes. They thought I would never leave. By the end of that week, I had received 3 offers on the house, 2 of which exceeded the asking price, and I accepted the cleanest offer with a 30-day close, waived contingencies, and immediate funds transfer upon inspection, because I wanted to leave no room for delay, argument, or second-guessing once they found out what I had done. I called the moving company, booked the full-service package with storage, and requested a weekday afternoon appointment, which guaranteed the lowest visibility among the neighbors and avoided weekend foot traffic that might alert my son through second-hand chatter. With the sale underway and the move scheduled, I began writing the letter that would serve as my final contact with my son and his wife, keeping the tone cold, direct, and emotionless, because I had already wasted enough time explaining myself to people who never once listened unless it benefited them. I wrote that I had sold the house, that I was moving to a facility where visitors were restricted to approved lists, and that I no longer intended to provide financial or logistical support of any kind, effective immediately, with no further discussion required or permitted. I wrote that this decision was the result of their conscious choices, their failure to prioritize my health, their casual cruelty, and their shameless requests for money during my most vulnerable moment. And I made it clear that this was not about punishment, it was about boundaries they had ignored for too long. I attached a photocopy of the house deed transfer, a receipt of the bank transaction that confirmed the deposit to the new account, and a copy of the visitor restriction form I had filed with Facility A, which made it legally binding that they could not appear without my explicit written permission. I sealed the envelope, hand-delivered it to the courier office, and requested signature confirmation upon delivery to ensure there would be no claims of miscommunication or missing mail. They would receive it the day after the furniture was removed. I reviewed the checklist again. House sold, bank accounts moved, utilities cancelled, mail forwarding arranged, final medical records transferred, power of attorney documents rewritten with no named beneficiary, and digital account credentials changed so they would never have access to anything again. I had erased their access from every part of my life. They would learn what it meant to be cut off not in anger but in indifference. They would realize that they were no longer entitled to anything. They had chosen convenience over compassion, and now they would live with the cost. The morning the movers arrived, I handed them the prepared list of what to take, signed the release form for full-service packing, and directed them to remove every item I didn't plan to bring to Facility A while keeping aside only one suitcase, one locked folder, and my handbag, because I wanted nothing left in that house that could be claimed, disputed, or misused after I left. The men worked quickly and efficiently, loading furniture, boxes, and appliances into the truck while I sat in the kitchen chair one last time reviewing the updated balance in my account, which now reflected the full deposit from the house sale, 32 million yen, cleared and transferred just hours before the truck pulled into the driveway. I received a call from the retirement facility's administrator confirming that my room would be ready by the end of the day and that the car would be dispatched by 2 p.m. And I confirmed that I would be waiting at the agreed-upon location with all my belongings in hand, ready to begin the check-in process with no delays. At exactly 1:47 p.m., while the movers were taping the last boxes and locking the truck, I heard a car screech into the street, and when I looked up from my final checklist, I saw my son and his wife stepping out in visible panic after realizing that the house, the one I paid for, maintained, and protected, was being emptied without their knowledge or permission. They rushed toward the entrance, trying to push past the movers, demanding answers, calling out my name, asking what was happening, and I stood up, handed the foreman the final payment in cash, and walked toward the door without acknowledging them until I was face to face with the people who had once left me to recover from surgery alone. My son asked me what was going on, his voice breaking, his words frantic, and I handed him the sealed letter I had mailed the day before and told him the delivery must have arrived late, but the content inside would answer every question he was about to ask, and I made it clear that no conversation beyond that would take place. His wife started crying immediately, grabbing my sleeve, asking why I hadn't told them anything, begging me to wait, promising they could fix everything, and I told her that they had already made it clear where their priorities lay when they chose to throw a birthday party while I faced a surgeon alone. She accused me of overreacting, saying it was just one mistake, that families argue and make up, that I was being too harsh, and I reminded her that when she sat at my bedside and said her birthday mattered more than my operation, I made a decision to end the cycle of manipulation permanently. My son raised his voice, accusing me of acting irrationally, asking if I had been pressured, hinting at mental instability, demanding to know why I would do something so extreme without involving him. And I told him that the same man who told me to go alone had forfeited any claim to be consulted in my decisions. I told him I had sold the house because it was mine to sell, that I had moved my accounts because I no longer trusted him with access to my life, and that I was leaving not out of spite but out of survival, because a parent who isn't valued is just a resource to be drained. He told me I was ruining the family, that I was embarrassing him, that the neighbors were watching, and I pointed at the neighbors who were, in fact, watching from driveways and porches, whispering to each other, piecing together what was clearly unfolding, and I asked him how it felt to have his behavior exposed in broad daylight. His wife knelt and pleaded with me, saying they didn't mean it, that they were just overwhelmed, that I had taken things too far, And I reminded her that I had watched her post steak dinners and dessert platters online while I lay alone in a recovery bed, wondering if anyone would ever show up. She said she regretted it, that she wished they had come, that she understood now how much it must have hurt, but I could hear in her voice the fear of losing the money, not the fear of losing me, and I had no intention of letting guilt rewrite history. They asked where I was going, how I could do this, what they were supposed to do now, and I told them that they had a rental lease, a car, and each other, and that for the first time in decades, they would have to build a future without depending on the woman they dismissed until her usefulness expired. I walked past them, handed the movers the final address for delivery, thanked them for their help, and turned my back as they begged me to stop, cried that they had learned their lesson, promised to change, and reached for me with the same hands that had once pushed me aside for cake and candles. They wanted forgiveness without accountability. They wanted my money without my pain. They wanted access without presence. I entered the waiting car from Facility A, placed my suitcase in the back, sat down beside the folder that held the final confirmation papers, and told the driver to go, ignoring the tapping on the windows, the shouting behind us, the desperate performance of people who realized too late that they had overplayed their hand. As the car pulled away, I didn't look back. They had spent years looking right through me. As soon as I arrived at the retirement facility, I completed the final paperwork, submitted my identification, confirmed my visitor restriction preferences, handed over the medical history forms, and signed the declaration ensuring that no family member, including my son or his wife, would be granted access to my room, records, or schedule unless explicitly approved in writing with notarized documentation. I handed over the certified check for the full move-in fee, confirmed the monthly payment plan using my new account, and requested all mail be redirected to the facility's private reception, because I wanted to ensure that no letters, notes, or manipulative apologies could be slipped into my old mailbox or used to make me feel responsible for anyone's discomfort. The staff gave me an overview of the available activities, healthcare options, and resident policies, and I chose the most private schedule possible, declining open visitor days, opting out of phone call access, and making it clear that any attempts to contact me should be met with firm denial, because I had lived too long being accessible to people who ignored me until they needed something. I unpacked only the essentials, my identification, my medical prescriptions, the sealed will I had rewritten naming a legal executor outside the family, and the photo of my late husband, who would have never let this happen had he lived long enough to see the son we raised forget which parent paid for his degree and his down payment. For the next week, I ignored every missed call, voicemail, and message that tried to reach me, watching them pile up with increasing desperation, changing from confusion to outrage to pleading, and I instructed the front desk to begin blocking all calls from their numbers and return all attempted deliveries unopened. They asked why I was being so cold, forgetting they left me cold in a hospital bed. They called me cruel, forgetting they had mocked my fear of surgery. They begged for forgiveness, forgetting they never asked for permission to disregard me. I knew they would shift the story, tell others that I was unstable, frame me as difficult, try to convince extended relatives that I had lost touch with reality, and I didn't care, because the only reality that mattered was the one where I no longer had to shrink myself into a role that served their convenience. My son texted that they couldn't make rent, that the mortgage payments had ballooned, that credit card debt was accumulating, and that Brittany had possibly lost her job after taking time off to deal with family stress. And I didn't reply, because they had been careless with their choices and now wanted me to absorb the consequences of their priorities. They had thrown a luxury birthday dinner during my crisis, spent thousands on photos and desserts, posted it proudly for attention, and only after the money ran dry did they remember the mother they had sidelined like an afterthought. He sent photos of Brittany crying, of their apartment cluttered with unopened bills, of empty plates on a bare kitchen table, asking if I really wanted to let them struggle while I lived in comfort. And I stared at the images without sympathy, because these were not the actions of children seeking connection, they were the tactics of people trying to manipulate their way back into a lifestyle they didn't earn. They forgot I had read every message they sent during my hospital stay, including the ones where they laughed off my fear as old age drama, where they debated whether they had to go see her or whether sending flowers was enough, and those words were burned into my memory, sharp enough to slice through any apology. They forgot I had seen the receipts on Brittany's social media, designer handbags, imported wine, spa packages, and those posts weren't deleted, just buried under newer ones claiming hardship, as if the past would vanish if they posted enough distress. I made no public statement. I didn't respond to their relatives. I didn't argue or explain. I just disappeared from the role they had cast me in. I updated my medical file to reflect my new emergency contact, Attorney C, and made it clear that in the event of hospitalization, notification was to go only to the designated legal team, because I didn't want to wake up from another surgery to find no one had come again. I revised my will again, this time removing even the possibility of a final reconciliation clause, striking all references to my son and his wife, and assigning my estate to a charitable fund that provided housing and education for single mothers who raised children without support. They asked why I would rather give money to strangers. I remembered giving everything to family and being abandoned anyway. They asked how I could turn my back on blood. I remembered how quickly blood turned its back on me. I spent my afternoons attending workshops, not to socialize but to keep myself occupied, filling my days with structure that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations or schedules. When other residents asked if I had family, I simply said I had outgrown them, and they nodded in quiet understanding, because many of them had felt it too, the moment when your child stops seeing you as a person and starts seeing you as a backup plan. I no longer felt the need to justify my actions. I no longer apologized for protecting myself. They had made their choices with clarity and calculation. Now they would live with the silence they created. A week after I moved in, Facility held its first family visitation event of the month, and while other residents prepared for their children and grandchildren to arrive with flowers, baked goods, and weekend plans, I remained in my room without adding my name to the list because I had no intention of spending another second entertaining people who only remembered me when their wallets ran dry or their reputation was at stake. While staff moved through the halls delivering visitor passes and calling out last names for sign-in, I declined all offers of coffee or shared lounge activities and focused instead on submitting my registration for the facility's estate planning seminar, where I would finalize the legal allocation of my remaining assets to organizations that had helped women like me survive the silence of abandonment. My phone continued to display blocked call alerts, voicemail transcriptions, and unread messages from numbers I recognized instantly but would never engage with again, because if a son needs to be blocked like a spam caller, he doesn't deserve to be called family. Brittany's parents attempted contact next, sending a handwritten letter marked urgent, asking for a conversation to clarify things, claiming they had no part in their daughter's actions, but I returned it unopened and instructed the front desk to log their name under the restricted visitor list, because silence was the only language they had ever respected from me. When their attempts to reach me failed, my son turned to mutual acquaintances, former neighbors, distant cousins, and even one former co-worker, telling them exaggerated stories of my supposed instability, suggesting I had been manipulated, confused, or coerced into selling the house and cutting ties, hoping someone would convince me to reverse course. But the people he contacted had seen enough of his behavior over the years to decline involvement. One of the neighbors forwarded me a message he had sent, claiming I had abandoned my own blood for strangers, and attached a photo of their half-packed apartment with captions begging for sympathy, but I replied only to the neighbor and asked them never to send me updates again, because I had made peace with the fact that suffering doesn't always make people kinder, sometimes it just makes them louder. They claimed they were homeless, even though their names were still on a lease I co-signed years ago, and they used the word betrayal as if I was the one who disappeared, forgetting that I had gone through surgery without so much as a phone call while they drank wine and posed for photos in outfits more expensive than the food they refused to buy me post-discharge. They wrote that they were expecting a child and needed stability, that this was no longer just about them but about the future of an innocent life, and they implied that withholding support from an unborn grandchild was unforgivable, but I didn't respond, because guilt is a currency used by those who know they've already spent your love without asking how much it cost. They said I had changed, that the mother they remembered would never turn away in a moment like this, that I used to be warm and supportive, but what they called change was actually clarity, and what they called coldness was simply the absence of their entitlement being catered to for the first time. They used pregnancy like a weapon, family like a shield, and desperation like a mask, forgetting that I had watched them choose luxury over loyalty and comfort over compassion when I was the one who needed them most. They accused me of emotional cruelty, but they never once called the hospital to check on my condition, never once offered to drive me home, never once asked if I was scared, and never once showed up before the house was already gone. Their apologies were timed with their needs, not their remorse. Their regret came too late, after the inheritance disappeared and the door closed. They didn't want reconciliation, they wanted restoration of benefits. I began ignoring the alerts entirely, unsubscribed from the digital family calendar Brittany used to maintain, and deleted old photos from my devices, not out of spite but out of necessity, because I had spent enough years pretending that connection meant care when it only meant obligation. I updated my burial preferences, opting for a private prepaid plan with no public ceremony and no next of kin notification, and I named the legal executor from the law firm as the final authority on any posthumous matters, because I didn't want the same people who neglected me in life using my death to regain sympathy or social standing. I reviewed the pension disbursement schedule, updated the beneficiary list to reflect charitable designations, and drafted a letter to be sent after my passing that would notify only the attorney's office and the charities involved, not a single person related to me by blood. They took my silence for granted until it became permanent. They counted on my forgiveness until it expired. They assumed I would never walk away until the door was already locked. Residents who had seen the commotion on move-in day asked me questions in hushed tones, wondering what had happened, what led me to cut off my only child so cleanly, and I gave the same answer every time, that if someone leaves you to suffer alone, they forfeit the right to stand beside you in your peace. I joined the calligraphy workshop not to socialize, but because I wanted to reclaim the stillness they stole from me by turning every conversation into a transaction, and I used every stroke of the brush to rewrite the story they tried to script on my behalf. They thought I would always be available. They thought I had nowhere else to go. They thought they had time to fix it. But I had already left. 3 weeks after I moved into the facility, I received a letter forwarded from my old mailing address, this time handwritten by my son, not typed, not formatted, not performative, but filled with frantic scribbles and underlined pleas, begging me to reconsider, to speak to him once more, to understand that he hadn't meant to hurt me and that everything was falling apart, and he ended the letter with the sentence, "We don't know how to live without your help," which told me more about his mindset than anything else he'd ever said before. He didn't say he was sorry for leaving me at the hospital. He didn't acknowledge the surgery I went through alone. He didn't take responsibility for mocking me while I was still recovering. He only wrote that they were behind on payments, that Brittany's parents refused to help because they were embarrassed by the way we handled things, and that he was being threatened with eviction unless they caught up by the end of the month. He didn't include a return envelope. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't even remember to address me as Mom in the final paragraph. It was a letter of panic, not remorse, an attempt to recover access, not rebuild trust, and I placed it in the drawer beside the others I'd received since cutting them off, not because I needed to save it, but because I wanted a clear archive of what desperation looks like when entitlement runs out. 3 days later, Facility A informed me that someone had attempted to deliver flowers to my room despite being on the restricted list, and they offered to place them in the lobby or discard them per my preference, and I told them to discard everything, no matter the name or occasion, because I had no interest in receiving gifts from people who only sent them after realizing they had nothing left to take. I received an email from my former neighbor notifying me that my son had been seen standing outside the facility entrance, asking questions about visitation policies, trying to find out when I took walks, when I used the dining hall, whether there was any way he could accidentally run into me. And I filed a formal security request to ensure that if he attempted contact on the property again, he would be issued a no-contact notice by the administration. He turned to the last tactic he hadn't yet tried, posting publicly on social media using photos of us from over a decade ago, writing long captions about how much he missed me, how he didn't understand what went wrong, how he hoped the people reading would urge me to forgive him and give him another chance. But what he didn't mention was that those photos were taken on trips I had paid for entirely, where he hadn't lifted a finger to plan or contribute. The captions framed me as an elderly woman in distress, possibly confused, possibly manipulated, possibly isolated by outsiders who didn't want me to reconnect with my real family, and he used phrases like unconditional love and forever grateful, while never once addressing the fact that he had left me to face anesthesia alone without even asking who my surgeon was. His followers expressed sympathy, asked what happened, sent him messages of support, and he reshared every one of them with a broken heart emoji while deleting the few comments that asked why he hadn't shown up when it mattered. He presented the fallout as a mystery, a misunderstanding, a tragedy he had no part in creating. But I knew that if someone has to beg strangers for forgiveness on your behalf, it means they know you'll never offer it yourself. Brittany posted separately, writing that pregnancy had taken a toll on her mental health, that the stress of being rejected by her husband's family was unbearable, and that they were doing everything they could to rebuild a life without the guidance and support they once took for granted. But she didn't mention her birthday dinner, her luxury handbags, or her refusal to accompany me to the hospital when it counted. She framed herself as a victim of generational conflict, ignoring that I had spent 38 years sacrificing so she could marry into a home with a roof I paid for and utilities I quietly covered. And now that I had removed myself from the equation, they wanted to rewrite the story without correcting the facts. I printed out every post, highlighted every lie, every omission, every reframing attempt, and filed it next to the letter, because I wanted a record of how quickly people rewrite history when they lose access to your resources. They thought public sympathy would pressure me. They thought shame would guilt me into responding. They thought strangers could succeed where empathy had failed. But I didn't respond, not online, not in private, not even through intermediaries, because I had already paid the price of being available, and this time I was keeping the peace I bought with silence. I scheduled my next round of medical screenings through the facility's private clinic, authorized only the attorney to receive updates, and kept my health matters sealed from all family inquiries, because I would never again give anyone the opportunity to ignore me during a medical emergency and then pretend they cared afterward. I made it clear in every legal form and facility document that I would not allow anyone to speak on my behalf except the executor of my estate, and that any attempt by family to regain access would be considered coercion, not concern. They weren't worried about my health. They were worried about what I might do with the rest of what I owned. They didn't miss me. They missed my money. And when you finally see that clearly, you stop answering every knock, every letter, every desperate performance of regret. They believed they were owed a second chance without earning it. I believed I was owed dignity without asking for it. I didn't abandon them. I just stopped waiting for them to show up. For weeks after I moved into the facility and cut off all contact, I received a final legal notice from my son's email address, not sent by an attorney, not filed properly, but formatted to look like a cease and desist letter, warning me that if I didn't return a portion of the property sale proceeds, they would be forced to take legal action to reclaim inheritance rights. And when I forwarded it to my attorney, he confirmed what I already knew, that it had no legal standing and was simply a poorly veiled threat disguised as formality. They wanted to scare me into giving them what they were never promised. They believed inheritance was a birthright, not a privilege earned by love or respect. They expected generosity from a woman they left to bleed alone. That fake legal notice included bold claims that I was mentally unwell, that I had been manipulated by strangers into selling the house without family approval, that I was experiencing confusion and memory loss, and that they were exploring options to declare me unfit in order to regain financial oversight. And that was the final line I needed to see before initiating the next step of my plan. I gave my attorney the green light to file a legal affidavit affirming my mental competency, submitted medical evaluations from Facility A's physician to corroborate my decision-making capacity, and added an official declaration of intent that I had willingly removed my son and his wife from all financial and medical rights permanently, effective immediately and without the possibility of reversal or appeal. I transferred a large portion of my remaining assets into an irrevocable charitable trust, ensuring that the funds could never be accessed by anyone without a court order, and even then, only for purposes outlined in the original mission statement, which stated clearly that the trust existed to support abandoned elderly parents and single mothers left behind by neglectful families. My son had tried to weaponize legal language without understanding the systems I had spent a lifetime managing, forgetting that I once worked for a company where I was responsible for vetting claims, reviewing documents, and flagging fraudulent tactics just like the ones he was now attempting to use against me. He underestimated my ability to fight back quietly. He underestimated my knowledge of the law. He underestimated my willingness to cut him off completely. After the legal protections were secured, I filed an additional restriction with Facility A, requesting that any future attempts by my son or his wife to enter the premises, submit medical claims, or request information about my status be met with a formal report to the authorities, and I listed both of them by name in the system, marked as exploitative risk. They hadn't just failed me emotionally, they had crossed into financial coercion, digital manipulation, and now legal intimidation, and I was done responding with silence. They tried everything but taking responsibility. They tried threats instead of apologies. They tried paperwork instead of compassion. In the following days, I received no more messages, no more flowers, no more social media posts, and for a brief period, the silence returned, not the wounded kind, not the forgotten kind, but the earned kind, the silence that comes when your boundaries are finally respected, not because they understand you, but because they know you can no longer be moved. I updated my long-term care preferences, prepaid future costs, and met with the facility director to establish a succession plan for my affairs that would require no outside family involvement, and when she asked me if I had any relatives to notify in the event of emergency, I simply said no, because I would rather be alone and protected than surrounded and exploited. I joined a small financial literacy group offered by the facility not because I needed help managing money, but because I wanted to help other residents understand how to protect themselves from the exact kind of manipulation I had endured for years without speaking about it. And I shared everything, the story, the timeline, the proof, the paper trail, so no one else would feel crazy for refusing to fund the lives of people who treated them like a burden. Several other residents approached me privately afterward, sharing stories of sons, daughters, nieces, and nephews who drained their accounts, forged signatures, demanded inheritances, or made them feel guilty for wanting a single quiet day without interruption, and we began to build a network of witnesses, not just survivors, women who had been told their needs were secondary to everyone else's until they finally said no. They thought we were soft because we didn't scream. They thought we were weak because we gave. They thought we were broken because we walked away. But we were watching. We were documenting. We were preparing. That group became the first space I'd entered in years where no one asked what I could give, only what I had been through, and each story confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, that my situation was not rare, it was routine, hidden only by the shame that comes with realizing your own child sees you as disposable. I suggested we form a legal referral system inside the facility, providing vetted access to attorneys who specialized in elder protection law, asset security, and power of attorney revocation, and the administration approved the plan with full support, assigning us a room once a week to meet and strategize. because they saw the value in letting women protect themselves before it was too late. My name appeared on the facility bulletin under peer resource, and I made it clear that I wasn't interested in becoming a therapist or a martyr. I just wanted every woman in that building to know she had options, even if her own family told her she didn't. The more I shared, the more I realized they all had one thing in common. They were waiting for permission to choose themselves, and I had finally given them that. They saw me as a woman who had done the unthinkable and survived. I saw myself as a woman who had finally done the necessary. And I never once regretted walking away. 2 months after my move, Facility A hosted its quarterly review session where residents were invited to update emergency contacts, health directives, and personal file notes, and I took the opportunity to permanently lock every field associated with next-of-kin communication, replacing all entries with attorney information and a legal note declaring my choice to sever all biological family ties due to prolonged emotional neglect and attempts at financial coercion. I signed a new form confirming that no family members would be contacted under any circumstance, not even in the event of death or unconscious hospitalization, and I declined to provide any secondary contact because I had already lived through a moment where my only child treated my urgent surgery as a nuisance, and that memory was enough to confirm that silence was safer than trust. I submitted a separate request to have my estate executor release a formal notice upon my passing that all funeral arrangements were prepaid, non-ceremonial, and not to be disclosed to any known family members, because I knew how quickly the same people who ignored me in life would show up in death to pose as grieving victims while searching for leftover benefits. I included a detailed clause in my legal packet that all inquiries made by Ethan or Brittany or any person acting on their behalf were to be forwarded directly to my attorney with no personal response, and that any in-person attempts to visit were grounds for immediate security removal and notification of legal counsel. I met with the facility's director and clarified my living preferences again, ensuring that I was removed from all family-related social invitations, group events, or programming involving external guests, because I no longer wished to exist in spaces where people assumed everyone had someone waiting for them. Later that week, a care assistant discreetly informed me that my son had attempted to visit again under a false name, this time claiming to be delivering documents on behalf of a legal office, and I instructed the staff to file a formal trespass record and flag his name in the facility system so that any future entry attempt would trigger automatic legal escalation. They had gone from absent to aggressive, from indifferent to entitled, and now from manipulative to fraudulent, all in the span of a few weeks, simply because the door they once assumed would always be open had been locked without warning and with full legal reinforcement. I didn't react. I didn't respond. I documented everything. I requested an updated security protocol review to ensure no loopholes remained, and the facility confirmed that my room, medical access, and visitor settings were now completely insulated, requiring biometric staff clearance for any file changes or physical contact, meaning that even a nurse couldn't share my status without triggering a compliance alert. The next day, I received a letter from a third-party mediation firm claiming that Brittany had retained their services to explore reconciliation and shared resolution, offering a session at a neutral location where all grievances could be addressed, and I faxed the document directly to my attorney, who responded by filing a formal cease and desist with the mediation firm and reminding them that my position was already documented through notarized and registered directives. They were still trying to recover access through performance, still trying to guilt me into conversation through intermediaries, still pretending that this was a misunderstanding instead of a deliberate abandonment that began the moment they decided my medical emergency was less important than cake and celebration. They called it family drama. I called it survival. They called it heartbreak. I called it clarity. Every tactic they used backfired because they were trying to force intimacy with someone they had discarded, trying to re-enter a life they once opted out of, trying to treat me like a safety net when I had already burned the rope. They assumed time would soften me. They assumed pregnancy would sway me. They assumed money would return if their language became more polished. But I had passed the point of reconciliation the moment I was forced to check into surgery with no hand to hold, the moment I woke up without a single message, the moment I heard them dismiss my fear as dramatic and my pain as inconvenient. I redirected my time to mentoring 2 women at the facility who were considering similar steps but still afraid of public fallout, and I showed them the process start to finish, how to freeze accounts, transfer property, rewrite wills, and enforce visitation restrictions, because power begins the moment you stop asking for permission to protect yourself. We drafted documents together. We filed asset transfers together. We deleted guilt, one clause at a time. I watched these women reclaim their voice with every notarized document, with every signed page, with every locked door they once left cracked open out of fear or duty. And I reminded them that saying no once can undo a lifetime of being taken for granted. They taught their children that love comes with boundaries. I taught myself that motherhood does not require martyrdom. Facility A offered me a chance to host a monthly workshop for new residents, and I accepted, not for recognition but to ensure that no woman entering that building ever again believed that being alone meant being powerless. I printed and distributed a checklist titled, "When They Stop Showing Up," listing every legal and emotional step needed to reclaim financial control and emotional independence from entitled relatives. And I kept extra copies in the common area, replenishing them weekly as they were quietly taken, never returned, but always used. I was no longer just a mother who walked away. I was a blueprint. I was no longer just a woman who had enough. I was a warning. And I was never going back. 6 weeks after their last failed attempt to reach me, my son submitted a final desperate request through a legal messaging portal, attaching a typed letter labeled "Urgent Family Matter," in which he claimed that Brittany had been hospitalized due to complications in her pregnancy, that their financial situation had worsened, that he was out of work and facing eviction, and that he was asking one last time for help, in the spirit of family, implying that if I didn't step in now, I would be turning my back on not only him, but on my unborn grandchild, whose existence he had repeatedly used as leverage rather than as a reason to grow up and take responsibility for his failures. He wrote that he didn't understand how I could be so heartless after raising him with such care, that he didn't recognize the woman I'd become, that it felt like someone had taken his mother away and replaced her with a stranger who only cared about money and isolation. And yet he failed to acknowledge even once that I had gone through a major surgery alone, unsupported, and dismissed like an inconvenience when I needed him most. He asked why I was punishing him and Brittany when all they ever wanted was a happy life, ignoring the fact that their happiness had always been subsidized by my sacrifices, funded by my retirement savings, and maintained through decades of quiet giving that was never once repaid with presence, empathy, or basic human decency when it mattered most. He said they had nothing left and didn't know where else to turn, but even in his desperation, there was no genuine reflection, no accountability, no direct apology for the birthday dinner, the dismissive words, the refusal to show up, the cruel comments at my bedside, or the calculated attempt to regain access through emotional manipulation and false legal threats. He called it a family crisis. I called it the result of entitlement unchecked for too long. He called it abandonment. I called it protection. I did not respond to his letter. I forwarded the message to my attorney, who drafted a final formal reply stating that I would not be engaging in any further contact, that all prior directives remained in full effect, that any continued attempts to bypass legal restrictions would be treated as harassment, and that no further warnings would be issued if the boundary was crossed again. That letter was delivered by certified mail, signed upon receipt, and stored in our file as evidence of final contact, closing the chapter on a relationship that had already died the day he made a reservation for his wife's birthday instead of sitting next to his mother during a life-threatening procedure. He responded to that final letter by deleting every social media post, removing every photo that featured me, scrubbing his timeline of public evidence that he had tried to position himself as the wounded son. And I knew then that it was no longer about reconciliation or access. It was about shame, reputation, and the realization that he had run out of ways to control the story. He didn't want to fix what he broke. He wanted to hide it. He didn't want to earn my trust back. He wanted to pretend it never happened. He didn't want forgiveness. He wanted silence. I received confirmation that the charitable trust had completed its first disbursement to a housing organization that supports single elderly women displaced by family abandonment, and I requested that future disbursements be made quarterly in my name, anonymously if possible, because I didn't need credit, I needed impact. I requested a printout of my remaining assets and reviewed the totals calmly, with no anxiety or urgency, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that not a single cent would ever again be redirected to people who viewed me as an obligation rather than a person. I enrolled in an advanced legal planning course offered by a retired judge at the facility and began assisting other residents with document reviews and asset protection strategies, because if my story had taught me anything, it was that the real betrayal isn't always what they do, it's how long we stay quiet while they do it. I was no longer the woman who begged for presents, who waited for calls, who believed that blood would save me from loneliness, and I knew that what I had done was not revenge. It was survival built on clarity, reinforced by boundaries, and executed with the precision of someone who had nothing left to prove. I created a binder labeled Final Affairs, with every legal directive, password, instruction, and post-mortem instruction documented and notarized, so that no one would ever again twist my legacy or use my absence to make themselves look like a victim of grief when they had been the architect of my isolation. I scheduled a final will revision with the attorney to ensure that even in the event of asset liquidation or facility transfer, the distribution plan remained untouchable, and I added a personal clause stating that no relatives were to be notified, contacted, or consulted for any reason during or after my death. I updated my facility profile to request cremation with no service, no gathering, and no public acknowledgement, with a final transfer of funds to a women's legal defense network listed as the final action in my name, closing the loop I had opened when I chose peace over performance. I didn't want memorials. I didn't want speeches. I didn't want anyone pretending they had known the value of my presence once I was gone. I wanted truth. I wanted boundaries. I wanted the silence I had once feared and now finally understood. Because sometimes, the greatest act of love is removing yourself from the people who never deserved your presence in the first place. Because sometimes, closure doesn't come from apology, it comes from a locked door that never reopens. Because sometimes, family is not a bond, it's a lesson. By the end of the third month, the staff at Facility A informed me that a new resident orientation group would be forming and asked if I wanted to offer any insight or guidance, and without hesitation I prepared a written packet detailing every step I had taken since the day my son dismissed my surgery as unimportant, organizing each action by urgency and consequence, so that anyone who had ever been made to feel invisible could understand exactly how to reclaim what was taken from them under the disguise of love. I compiled a checklist titled When They Call You Selfish, outlining how to create private accounts, assign legal representation, remove next of kin rights, and reallocate assets with no apology, and I placed a copy in every mailbox on the resident wing. Because it was no longer enough to survive, I wanted others to feel the power of deciding their lives without waiting for permission from the people who failed them. I continued receiving facility updates, pension summaries, and trust disbursement reports, and I reviewed each document with quiet focus, ensuring that every transfer reflected my values, not inherited expectations, because the years I had left were not for repair or reconciliation but for living without shame, guilt, or obligation to those who had disrespected me the moment I stopped giving them what they wanted. I stopped counting the calls they had made, the letters they had sent, the tactics they had tried, because none of it changed the reality that when I needed comfort, I was met with contempt, and when I needed help, I was told to go alone, and when I asked for presents, I was reminded that someone else's dinner was more important. They never asked how long the recovery took, how many nights I lay awake wondering why I still believed they would come, or how much it cost me emotionally to hear my son laugh off my suffering while waiting for dessert to be served at a restaurant I had once helped him afford. They had not been shut out by accident. They had been removed because I finally accepted that there is no love in loyalty that only exists when it's convenient, and no redemption in regret that only arrives when the benefits vanish. I kept the final version of my will in a locked drawer, a document with no room for interpretation, no language of forgiveness, no space for redirection, only clear evidence that I had taken everything back they assumed belonged to them simply because they were born to me. They had chosen absence when it mattered. They had chosen celebration over commitment. They had chosen silence over showing up. And now I had chosen myself. In the final calligraphy class I attended that season, one of the instructors asked the group to write a single word that reflected what they were most proud of, and while others wrote words like resilience and patience, I wrote boundary, because it had taken 70 years to learn that survival without boundaries is just another form of captivity. I didn't teach workshops to feel important. I taught them because every time I spoke, another woman came forward with a story of being drained, ignored, disrespected, or used until she had nothing left but shame for not leaving sooner. I didn't reallocate my wealth out of spite. I did it because nothing good ever came from funding people who used your kindness like an ATM code and your silence like a loophole. I didn't restrict visits out of bitterness. I did it because the moment someone leaves you in pain without care, they no longer qualify to stand in your peace. They had asked where their mother went. They had asked why the woman they remembered was gone. They had asked how everything fell apart so quickly. But I had not changed overnight. I had changed the moment I realized that love without respect is exploitation, and family without accountability is just another burden dressed as duty. I left the facility bulletin with one final message before the next round of residents moved in, a small typed sheet titled, "You are allowed," listing what no one ever tells you as a mother, a sister, a wife, a woman, that you are allowed to cut them off, to move in silence, to change your will, to stop answering, to protect yourself even if it shocks everyone around you, to leave the door closed and locked no matter who knocks. I had become the version of myself that didn't flinch when accused, didn't back down when pressured, didn't cry when guilt was weaponized, because I had already survived the deepest kind of betrayal, being forgotten in the exact moment I needed to be remembered. And now, with every day that passed, I lived fully, not because of what I'd gained, but because of what I'd finally let go of. The narrative ended the day I stopped playing the role they needed. The story began the day I wrote the ending myself.